how is fan different from what is called art in modern English? What is dhikr? What arts are related to the Quran? Describe the style, structures, and inspirations for the classical Islamic city. What is a masjid, the qibla, and mihrab? How does and doesn't Islamic art depict God, humans, and the prophets? If we want to discuss Islamic art, we certainly have to start by asking, what do we mean by art at all? If by art we mean the attempt of an artist to express themselves in some material format, then art is a cultural norm of Western cultures that began around the start of the modern period in the 16th and 17th centuries. If art is the material creation of an artist, designed to be put on a wall or in a gallery and to be appreciated for its beauty, then art as a category doesn't really apply to the pre-modern Islamic peoples, or any pre-modern peoples for that matter. However, if by art we just mean material creations of humans, where the creation's beauty is a significant factor, then we can say there's such a thing as art in the ancient world. Most pre-modern people have a notion of craft work, the production of paintings, architecture, fabrics, statues, and other decorative objects. The Romans called this ars, hence our word art and artisanal. The Greeks called it techne, the Persians called it hunar, and the Arabs called it fan. All these terms roughly overlap with what we mean by art today, although there are some key distinctions. Most importantly, classical art in the Islamic world is almost without exception practical. Islamic art, fan or hunar, is a beautiful object that does something. Beautiful books and calligraphy are to be read. Paintings display stories. A carpet is for sitting, resting, or prayer. Our modern notion of art for the sake of art, like a framed painting that just sits on a wall, is a foreign concept to ancient peoples everywhere, including Muslims. Also, very much unlike modern notions of art, fan generally downplays the artists themselves. Although there are certain artisans who become famous for their architecture or illustration, they usually aren't identified by them. If you go to a Western art museum today and see a Picasso, you need to know something about Picasso as an individual to understand what he's doing. That's what those little tags in the museums next to the art are for. They help you interpret what you're seeing by telling you about the individual who made it. We even call the art by the artist's name. It's a Picasso, a Rembrandt, a Basquiat. Fan, pre-modern Islamic art, rarely does this. The art isn't about the given individual who made it. There is no signature at the bottom corner. But neither of these features, playing up practical function or downplaying the artist, are unique to Islamic fan. Actually, it's modern Western notions of art that are unusual here. Okay, so then what is distinct to fan? What makes fan, Islamic art, distinct from other forms of human expression elsewhere? Well, strictly speaking, nothing at all. Like Islam itself, the products of Muslim hands are boundlessly diverse. If we want to be strict about it, Islamic art is any given Muslim's imagination and skill in a material medium. So really, the only thing Islamic about the art is the person who made it. And even that we can question. Consider the Dome of the Rock, the Qubat al-Sakra, in Jerusalem. It was constructed in the year 692, on the order of the Umayyad Caliph Abdul Malik. As Anyone who's ever seen this shrine would attest it is a masterpiece of Islamic art, and the basis of so much Islamic art and architecture that came after it. By anyone's definition, it is one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. The Caliph had artisans commissioned to build a circular shrine in Jerusalem, and the population of Jerusalem at the time was overwhelmingly Christian. So therefore, the local construction workers were Christians, not Muslims. But does that mean that this structure, which is covered from floor to ceiling with Quranic quotations and imagery, isn't Quranic art, just because the actual hands that made it weren't Muslim? That seems kind of odd. So let's work around this issue of definitions by grounding what we say in the Quran, the adoration of the Prophet Muhammad, and the Ummah, since those three things seem to mark a boundary between Islamic and not Islamic. And, like defining anything as obviously Islamic or not, we can note that setting such a boundary is asking for trouble. We could, correctly and without argument, claim that this dish that you're looking at is Islamic art, even though there's nothing particularly Quranic or even Muslim about it. It's just a dish. Now, sure, the person who made it was a Muslim, but does that make it Islamic art? So, just to keep things as straightforward as we can, we're going to use the Quran, the Prophet, and his Ummah as our jumping off points for what is Islamic art. Let's start with the Quran. The codex of the Quran, called the Mus'haf, that is, the Quran as a written manuscript, is probably the first object that we can absolutely call Islamic art. That is to say, the first time that someone who called themselves a Muslim created a deliberately beautiful object that had something to do with Islam was presumably the first scribes who wrote the Quran. Now, if you recall, the Quran insists that the believer remember God and God's messages to the human race. The word for this is dhikr, a remembrance, a reminder. A dhikr is something that reminds you of God. It can be an activity like a prayer or a ceremony, but it can also be an object. So, when you write a Quran or read a written Quran, the function of that object is to remind you of God and God's words. So, Quranic bookmaking is dhikr, a remembrance of God. And from the material Quran as a dhikr of God comes another Islamic art form, Khat Islami, Islamic calligraphy. Beautiful writing as a form of art. While the Quran is the origin point for Islamic calligraphy, calligraphy is in no way unique to Quranic writing and inscription. Hadith, poems, personal letters, gravestones, ceramics, and anything else that a Muslim may want to present beautifully can be rendered into calligraphy. The oldest forms of Arabic calligraphy are called Kufic, after the city of Kufa in Iraq. The Kufic script is angular and uses simple, bold strokes. From that comes the more cursive Naskh, or copying script, which flows and warps as needed by space and the artist's imagination. This is Arabic written more freely, more flowing, and more quickly. And by the way, this isn't just in Arabic either. Although the Arabic of the Quran is the starting point for this calligraphy, other languages which use the Arabic alphabet have their own calligraphies as well, such as Persian, Urdu, or Ottoman Turkish. And beyond that, other languages used by Muslims that don't use the Arabic alphabets also have their own calligraphic forms, from Chinese to English. One of the defining features of Islam is the internal self-understanding of the Ummah. That's what we previously called the intelligibly Islamic, something that a Muslim would recognize as Islam, even if they don't agree with the fact that it is Islamic. The Ummah, the worldwide community of Muslims, in a certain way, defines Islam. And in that sense, Islamic art can be defined by the shapes and forms employed most often by the people of the Ummah. Of those forms typical of Islamic art, in the places where there are a lot of Muslims, there are basically three sources of inspiration, all of which harken back to the Prophet and the first Ummah. Those are the styles of late antiquity generally, the style of Mecca, Muhammad's hometown, and the style and function of Medina, the city Muhammad made for his Ummah. When we talk about late antique art, we mean the art of the Roman Byzantines and the Persians most especially. And those arts left traces on the art of Muslims, who were, and are, after all, their ancestors. Islam didn't just appear in a day. The peoples of the late antique Roman and Persian empires slowly, over many generations, embraced Islam. And therefore, the art that these people created came along for the ride, becoming slowly Islamized. The early Muslims didn't adapt Roman and Persian art. It was always theirs. Three features of late antique art specifically come to mind. The first is the use of mosaic, decorative tile work. Now, the line between pre-Islamic and Islamic mosaic is blurry, and perhaps even a bit of an illusion. But when it comes to decorating walls, ceilings, and floors, the early Muslims followed their Persian and Roman ancestors and went with the use of tiles to create both geometric and organic forms. Take a look at these examples. While the use of frescoes, paint on wet plaster, wasn't unknown, when Muslims decorated their mosques, schools, shrines, bathhouses, and public works, the mosaic was usually the standard choice. The second late antique form was the use of the arch, the defining architectural feature of Roman civilization. And from their Roman ancestry, the arch would become the most ubiquitous feature of Umayyad art specifically. These Umayyad arches, marked by their distinctive white and red or white and black stripes, are found both in the Middle East and in the Islamic West, wherever the Umayyads held influence. But in the Islamic period, the Romans' Muslim descendants put a famous spin, as it were, on the Roman arch. That is, the Islamic dome. From a construction point of view, a dome is just an arch in 360 degrees. A flat circle turned into a sphere. A third feature of late antique art that passed into Islamic art was the use of the column. Both Romans and Persians used solid columns as braces for large roofs. It's how you create a wide open interior space, without having to use a roof made out of hay, wood, or fabric. And from that principle of the column, you create the tower, and most especially the minara, the minaret, or the mathana in Persian. The minaret is the tower from which the adhan, the call to prayer, is given. Often a minaret is attached to the side of a mosque, but not necessarily. And as Islamic history rolled on, especially around the 11th century, the presence of minarets would serve as a sign of Islam's presence in a given city from far away. And still today, traditional Islamic cities are still identifiable by their arrays of minarets pointing up to the heavens. Even more specific to Islamic art were those styles related to late antique Mecca and Medina, to Muhammad's own environment. Late antique Mecca is of course defined by the Kaaba, the center point of Islamic worship. The Kaaba is the Qibla, the direction in which Muslims pray when they say their salat from anywhere in the world. That is, the Kaaba is a point of orientation, the way you face when you do something significant, in this case, a prayer. In proper mosques or other places where Muslims habitually pray, the direction, the Qibla to the Kaaba in Mecca, is marked by a niche called a mihrab. The mihrab is something of a Jewish and Christian architectural feature that got turned inside out. In the ancient world, and in many places today, Jews pray in the direction of Jerusalem, and Christians pray facing the east. In both synagogues and churches, especially Middle Eastern ones, there are niches that are marked in the walls telling the faithful which way to direct their prayers. In the Jewish case, this niche facing Jerusalem is where the scrolls of the Tanakh, that is, the Torah and other important Hebrew writings, are stored. In the Christian case, this niche that points to the east contains some kind of sacred object or image, such as an icon, the relic of a saint, or a statue. And the earliest Muslims followed suit. After all, most of the first Muslims were Jews and Christians previously. But they removed the object of worship and left their mihrabs empty. No idols, no objects to face in prayer. Just the Qibla, the direction to the Kaaba in Mecca. The other striking feature of the Kaaba is that it's literally a cube, a stark black square in 3 dimensions. And in a circle around the Kaaba are the pilgrims, who traditionally wear gleaming white clothes. So, the Kaaba is 2 geometric forms at once, a black cube in the heart of a white circle. And thus, this geometry is likewise reflected in Islamic architecture, where circular shapes are contrasted to square ones and other shapes with hard angles. Consider designs like these. They're at once round and yet cornered. They are, in a symbolic way, the pilgrims in Mecca rendered as fractals and florals. Islamic carpets, mostly from Persia and Central Asia, likewise toyed with the creative clash of squares, rectangles, and circles. Classical Islamic cities, notably the famous round city of Baghdad, played with this mix of the circular surrounding the square. At the center of the Abbasid City of Peace was a circular wall, over a mile across. In the middle of it is a keep, a kasaba, a kasbah, in the middle. That is, where people could flee in case of invasion. So, later Islamic cities, in a symbolic representation of Mecca, tended to be circles with squares in the middle. And Medina influenced later Islamic art as well. Late antique Medina was defined by 2 features: the mosque and the Ummah itself. First is the masjid, the mosque. Although the term masjid, mosque, a place of prostration, predates Islam and seems to have been used by ancient Arabs just as a generic word for a place to pray, the word masjid is now purely Islamic. The original reference is to the house of Muhammad in Medina, which was built there upon his arrival after the Hijrah. The Prophet's mosque was a simple, rectangular series of apartments arranged around an open courtyard space, and this was a common style for a large family house in the Roman and Persian worlds. But the Islamic twist was that the courtyard was a public space where people could come and go freely. The most obvious feature of a masjid, a mosque, is that it's an open space for people to say the salat, especially the noon prayer on Fridays. But even though the masjid is quite empty as far as furnishings, you'll find that it's much more open to the public than your average synagogue or church is. Not only do people pray in mosques, mosques often function as shared spaces for the whole community. In most masjids, even today, you'll see people not only praying, but also reading, chatting, teaching, having meetings, sleeping, or just getting out of the sun. The masjid, in a way that can be rather striking, is truly the property of the ummah, the property of everyone in the community. And of course, that's why the first Islamic mosque came into being. It was at once the Prophet's home, but it was also the community's meeting house. And mosques, masjids today, retain this sense of open space and open invitation. And this sense of ummah, that Medina, the city, was the home of a community, carried on into future designs of Islamic cities in the classical period. While Islam did of course spread into already ancient cities like Damascus, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, Muslims had the habit of building new cities from scratch, which specifically displayed an Islamic aesthetic. Cities like Kufa, Fustat, medieval Cairo, and most especially Baghdad, stressed public features and shared spaces beyond just the mosques. Gardens, planted specifically to generate pleasant aromas of fruit, herbs, and flowers, would be fed by fountains and watermills open for public usage, drinking, cooking, and the performing of the wudu, the minor ablution for prayers. The same hydraulic engineering also produced public bathhouses with a variety of hot, cold, and scented waters. At once a place to relax, perform the ghusl, shave, play games, and spend the day with family and friends. And all the hot and cold running water added a bonus public utility: heating for when it was cold and air conditioning for when it was hot. It was these bathhouses, called Turkish baths in English, but hammams in most of the Islamic world, that also introduced the notion of the rub-down, called massa in Arabic, hence our word massage. And of course, a cleaner populace was also a very effective way to fight disease outbreaks too. A modern person would probably be very surprised by how many different kinds of public works were available in the classical Islamic city. Not only were there the mosques, the parks and the gardens and the bathhouses, there were public schools, madrasas, the next evolution of the Nizamiya university system, libraries, following after the model of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, orphanages, and hospitals, including animal hospitals. Developing from the Roman Forum, or the Greek Agora, was also the marketplace, the souk or shuk, or as they called them in Indonesia, the pasar, hence bazaar in English. Dividing the major streets of the city, especially those that ran between the large public buildings, one could buy goods in specially regulated districts under the protection of the city police force. Perhaps the most striking feature of what seems to be missing from the classical Islamic city is the private home. While public buildings and the souks were colorful and grandiose, private dwellings on the outside were much more subdued. One could easily walk past a plain door on a plain wall in a narrow street in a medieval Islamic city and not know if there was a closet or a palace on the other side. Most dwellings, whatever their size, would follow the blueprint of the Prophet's mosque in Medina. There would be a courtyard, usually open to the air, which served as the public space for the home, where guests would be received. And like how the Prophet's mosque was surrounded by living apartments which were not part of the public space, in the traditional Islamic home was the forbidden place, the haram, the harim, or the women's area, zanana in Urdu. But don't let the imagination of the 19th century British fool you. The harem is just the private area of a home where only family members go. The harem would be where you'd go to be alone, to change, to sleep, or to eat informally. Just like Jews and Christians have for their whole histories, Muslims have had a long, not always obvious relationship to naturalistic images of living things, especially humans, and most especially of prophets. Muslims, Jews, and Christians alike have moved back and forth between iconography, the use of human images, and iconoclasm, the discouraging of the use of human images. Islamic art has been both deeply iconic and deeply aniconic. Which was the order of the day, the use of iconography or not, was dependent on cultural norms, the fatwas of influential muftis, and one's historical context. But like all forms of fan, certainly the deciding factor behind iconographic work is utility. Remember that in the pre-modern world, we do not see art for art's sake. And so instead, we have to say, what is a certain piece of craft doing? Fan is craft work first, beautiful second. And so, the first question here isn't, are there Islamic images of people, including the prophets? There are, more than can be counted. The question is, what are these images for? In that sense, the one sure thing of the Islamic use of natural human forms is that idols are forbidden. The Quran and any interpretation of the Sunnah is clear on that. No image can be the focus of worship. Hence, there are no literal depictions of God at any time, human forms are never present in the masjid, and statues were considerably rare before the modern period. That is not to say that Islamic art never depicts God, though. It just tends to depict God either through the use of calligraphy, such as these examples of the word Allah, or God is displayed through the use of abstractions. Look at these repeating designs, which we would call arabesques in English. They may be floral, calligraphic, or geometric, but in an indirect way, they stand in for the imagery of God, showing God's permeation of his universe and infinite power, showing plenitude, the same shape and form again and again, and at the same time showing unity. As far as human images go, again the question is, well, what are the images for? Take a look at these Islamic miniatures from Persia and the Indian subcontinent. Here we see human forms, even of the prophets, including Muhammad. So, are these problematic? Well, remember that this is not art for art's sake. This is fan. So, these miniatures are illustrations in books. They aren't objects of adoration. They are made to demonstrate a story or to be a lesson to someone who's reading a book. Or, since this is the pre-modern world we're talking about here, these images are also demonstrations of Islamic content to someone who's looking at the book but can't read. At other times, a Muslim artisan will compromise on the matter in some way. Most famously, they will hide the faces of the prophets, but depict the faces of everyone else. In theory, this would prevent the onlooker from being tempted to think of the prophetic form as being holy or reverential in some way, as if putting the veil over the face of a prophet stops a person from idolizing them. For those Muslims who are deeply uncomfortable with the production of human forms of any kind, that is, people who think that such images beg to be adored in a way that constitutes shirk, there are still more workarounds. The notable example is the Hilya, the portrait of Muhammad in words. A calligraphy, usually of a hadith, although sometimes a poem, in which the prophet's appearance and personality is described. And of course, there are also much more simple calligraphies of just the name Muhammad, or of Ali, or of the other Rashidun caliphs, or of the Shiite imams. How is fan different from what is called art in modern English? What is dhikr? What arts are related to the Quran? Describe the style, structures, and inspirations for the classical Islamic city. What is a masjid, the qibla, and mihrab? How does and doesn't Islamic art depict God, humans, and the prophets?